On one Christmas Eve, in a quiet neighborhood where nothing unusual ever seemed to happen, a family noticed something resting on the windowsill of their daughter's room. It was a small box wrapped in faded Christmas paper. No footprints approached it. No marks in the snow showed anyone walking near the house. Yet the gift sat there as though someone had placed it with great care, inches from the glass, as if whoever left it wanted it to be seen the moment she woke. The storm that night was steady, the kind of winter weather that erases all traces within minutes. But the family knew, absolutely knew, that when they went to bed, there had been nothing outside that window. And whatever placed that box there had done so quietly enough that no one in the house heard a single sound. In every part of the world, holiday nights carry stories that never reach the newspapers. Quiet events, strange encounters, moments that leave families wondering what truly stood outside their homes while they slept. Most of these accounts are whispered from one person to another, shared only when the season returns and memories feel sharper. Tonight, you will hear one of those accounts. It comes from a family who had never experienced anything unusual, who live in a peaceful neighborhood where Christmas Eve was supposed to be simple. But what they found at their window that night would mark the beginning of a sequence of events they still struggle to explain. This story has been told carefully in measured detail because those involved wanted people to understand exactly what they experienced. Each sound, each discovery, each moment they questioned whether they were truly alone in their home. As the rain falls softly in the background, listen closely. Everything you're about to hear is part of a case that left investigators without answers, and a family with a memory they cannot forget. If you choose to continue watching, understand this. The first gift left by the window was only the beginning. The house stood at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, a little farther from the nearest street lamp than most homes on that road. During winter, the space between the house and the tree line filled with drifting snow that gathered in smooth sheets, untouched except for the paths the family cleared each morning. On Christmas week, a storm settled over the area, bringing long hours of wind that pushed against the siding and tapped lightly at the shutters, creating a rhythm that came and went without warning. Inside the home lived a couple and their teenage daughter. They were known for spending Christmas indoors, away from the noise of holiday gatherings, choosing instead to enjoy the simplicity of a warm fire, old movies, and the comfort of familiar routines. Nothing strange had ever occurred in their home. The nights were usually calm, and the winters, though harsh, were predictable. But in the days leading up to Christmas Eve, their daughter began mentioning something small, barely noticeable at first. She said she had heard faint sounds near her window at night. A light brushing, then a soft tap. At first, her parents assumed it was branches brushing the pane during the storm, or perhaps ice shifting as the temperature dropped. The house often made sounds in winter, and they didn't think much of it. Still, she insisted it wasn't the wind. She described it as controlled, measured, as if it were placed there with intention. And though her parents reassured her, each passing night left her increasingly uneasy. What she didn't know was that the fourth night would bring something that changed the entire tone of their holiday. On the night before Christmas Eve, the storm was at its strongest. Snow pushed across the yard in long waves, covering everything in moments. The family went to bed early, expecting to wake to a heavy layer of ice on the porch and long hours of shoveling the next morning. But around 2 a.m., their daughter awoke to a sound she could no longer convince herself was part of the weather. It was a knock, a single, distinct knock against her window. She sat up, listening. The wind roared, then calmed, and in the brief silence between gusts, the knock came again. Lighter this time, almost careful. She reached for her bedside lamp, but the bulb flickered before lighting, giving the room a dim, uneven glow. Slowly, she approached the window. Outside, snow was falling steadily, covering every surface in a thick white layer. But when she looked down at the sill, she saw it immediately, a small box wrapped in Christmas paper worn at the edges. The kind of wrapping they hadn't seen in years. The pattern looked old, faded, almost like something pulled from a trunk in an attic. She turned her eyes to the ground below the window. Nothing. No footprints. No disturbances in the snow. The yard was smooth and untouched. She stepped back, heart pounding, unsure whether to wake her parents or simply close the curtain and pretend nothing had happened. In the morning, the family gathered around the window, studying the box. It couldn't have been there the night before. Every one of them was certain of it. When they brought it inside and placed it on the dining table, the father hesitated before touching it, because inside this small, fragile package was something that shouldn't have existed anymore. When the father finally unwrapped the box, he froze. Inside lay a toy. Small, worn, unmistakably familiar. He recognized it instantly. It was a childhood keepsake he had lost after a tragedy years earlier, something he never spoke about, not even to his wife. The toy should have been gone forever. It had vanished in an incident no one outside his immediate family had ever known. Yet here it was, resting on their dining table, cold to the touch, as though it had been outside for hours. His wife asked him how it was possible. He couldn't answer. He simply stared at it, replaying old memories he had spent decades trying to forget. That night, the house seemed to react to their unease. The wind pressed harder against the windows. The floorboards shifted in long, slow creaks. At one point, they heard what sounded like footsteps outside, steady, spaced apart, moving across the snow with purpose. When the father checked, there was no one there, and the snow remained unbroken. Later, as the family tried to settle for the night, the lights flickered throughout the house. Not all at once, but room by room, as though something moved through the hallway, pausing just long enough for the bulbs to dim before continuing on. The daughter whispered to her mother, asking whether the sound they heard earlier, those soft steps, were from an animal or something else entirely. If something left you a childhood item no one else knew existed, would you open another box? Or would you leave the next one untouched? In the days that followed, the quiet rhythm of the family's holiday was replaced by a growing sense of unease. The first box might have been explained away, but the second night left no room for excuses. Another gift appeared on the windowsill, this time at the parents' bedroom window. The wrapping paper was the same faded design, edges worn, ribbon frayed. Inside was a small object tied to a memory the mother had never spoken aloud, a charm her sister had given her years before a fire took her life. She whispered that she had lost it in the debris. The father had never seen it. Their daughter had never even heard the story. The third night brought a third box. This one belonged to the daughter. It contained a folded note, blank, except for a single crease across the middle, the exact way she used to fold messages she slipped into her diary years earlier. No one else in the house had known about that habit, and yet the paper matched the texture and color of her old notebook pages, as though someone had pulled them from a place she could no longer reach. By this point, sleep became difficult. At exactly 2 a.m. every night, sounds began echoing from the attic above their rooms. At first they were faint, shifting boards, light taps, the quiet shuffle of something moving with purpose. But by the fourth night, the noises grew louder, more deliberate, as though whatever was above them no longer cared about being subtle. While the parents tried to rationalize each sound, their daughter was the first to see movement outside. She had risen from her bed to close the curtains when she noticed a shape standing near the edge of the tree line. The snowfall was heavy enough to blur most objects, yet this silhouette remained clear, too still, too defined, standing upright against the wind as though untouched by the cold. She stepped back slowly, never looking away, her breath catching in her throat. Moments later, the figure was gone. On the fourth night, they finally saw who, or what, was leaving the gifts. It happened just before dawn. The storm had calmed slightly, leaving the yard coated in thick snow that glowed faintly under the porch light. The family had gathered in the living room, too afraid to sleep after the knocking returned at 1:58 a.m., 2 minutes earlier than usual. This time they stayed together listening. At 2:03 a.m., the daughter noticed movement through the curtains. A shadow shifted across the yard, slow and deliberate. When they finally pulled the curtain aside, they saw it clearly, a figure standing halfway between the house and the trees. It didn't move. It didn't sway. The wind pressed against the trees, bending branches and pushing snow in long streams across the ground. Yet the figure remained completely still. Not a single flinch, not one sign of breath. They blinked. The figure stood closer, not by a step they had seen, but as though the space between the two moments had been changed, its position now several yards nearer. The father stepped back instinctively, gripping the curtain as though that thin fabric could shield his family. The father felt a memory rise to the surface, something he had locked away for decades. He remembered a childhood friend who vanished on a Christmas Eve long ago. A friend who had been with him the night the toy in the first box disappeared. A friend whose disappearance had never been explained. And the shape outside, its height, its stillness, matched the presence he remembered beside him during that final winter together. Just before sunrise, the family found something far more troubling than a figure in the yard. Wet footprints inside the house. They began at the back door, though the snow outside showed no impressions leading to it. The prints were uneven, spaced irregularly, as if the one who left them walked with a slow, dragging step. They trailed across the hardwood floor, turning down the hallway and stopping at the threshold of the daughter's room. Her door was slightly open. The father called her name softly, but she didn't respond at first. When she finally answered, her voice was shaky, as though she had been awake for hours listening to the movement outside her door. They followed the footprints back toward the attic steps, and just as the father reached for the pull cord, the attic door slammed shut with a force that shook dust from the ceiling. The family froze. Not one of them had touched it. Then, from behind the closed attic door, a faint voice drifted out, a whisper shaped around a name the father had not heard since childhood. It was the nickname only his missing friend had used, spoken in the same tone he remembered from decades earlier. He stepped back, his breath unsteady, as the house settled into a long stretch of silence. For the rest of the night, they remained together in the living room, too afraid to return to their rooms, too afraid to speak about what they had heard. The storm continued outside, but the house felt unnaturally quiet, as if something inside was waiting for their next move. At 3:17 a.m., the daughter gasped. There, on the staircase leading to the second floor, sat another box. No one had heard footsteps. No one had heard the door open. The box was dry, untouched by snow, as though it had been placed moments ago by someone standing inside the shadows. They didn't want to open it, but they also couldn't ignore it. With trembling hands, the father lifted the lid. Inside was a photograph of the daughter, asleep in her bed, taken that same night. The angle of the picture made it clear. Whoever captured it had been standing directly beside her pillow. So if you've ever had a moment on a holiday night that you cannot explain, a sound, a figure, a presence that you're certain was there even though nothing supports it, tell your story in the comments. Many people find clarity only after hearing someone else describe an experience they once kept to themselves. And stay with us. There is a family in rural Alberta who still avoids stepping onto their porch after sunset each December. Ever since the night, they heard singing drift through the trees behind their cabin. It was an old Christmas hymn, carried on a thin current of winter air, the kind of sound that should have been comforting, yet felt strangely out of place in a forest that had been silent for hours. The father remembers turning off the lamp in the living room and standing by the frosted window, listening closely. The voices were steady, almost formal, as if arranged in a practiced line, rising and falling with the calm precision of a choir that had rehearsed the same melody for generations. But as he leaned closer, he realized the singing wasn't approaching or fading. It held one fixed distance from the cabin, as though the performers were standing in a single unmoving circle just beyond the tree line. When he stepped onto the porch to look, the music continued with the same clarity, but the forest remained empty. No lanterns, no figures shifting between the branches, no signs of anyone passing through snow that should have recorded every step. He walked farther out, expecting to find at least a set of tracks, yet the ground was untouched, smooth from the snowfall earlier that evening. His wife later admitted she recognized the voices, not the individuals, but the arrangement itself. She had heard a recording of the same harmony years before, performed by a community choir whose members all lost their lives returning from a winter festival 2 decades earlier. The family never spoke openly about the event again, but each Christmas, at the exact same hour, the hymn returns with the same measured cadence, as though the singers are stationed permanently in the dark, keeping a vigil that never ends. Cases like this tend to appear in conversations only during the colder months, when the land feels wider and people have more time to reflect on what they once heard, saw, or sensed during a holiday night. Many of the accounts come from remote areas where snow settles early and stays long after the season ends, and where a single sound carries much farther than anyone expects. These stories are not passed around for amusement. They remain part of local memory, because those who experience them believe the events were tied directly to the stillness that surrounds Christmas in isolated regions. The report from Alberta stands out because of how consistent the family statements have been over the years. They live in a small cabin built along an old logging road, nearly 30 minutes from the nearest cluster of houses. During winter, the route to town became narrow and quiet, with snow covering most of the landmarks that visitors used to navigate. The cabin itself sat at the edge of a dense forest, and on most nights the only sounds were the shifting branches and the faint hum of wind sweeping between the pines. What makes their testimony particularly compelling is the timing. The singing always began near the end of Christmas Eve, when the house was closed up for the night and the family was settling into the kind of calm that comes only once each year. No vehicles approached. No neighbors were expected. The snowfall that night was steady enough to erase any earlier footprints, leaving the ground unmarked and the surroundings undisturbed. The setting alone would have encouraged most families to stay inside, yet the clarity of the voices drew them toward the window. What they heard was structured, coordinated, and unmistakably choral, a sound that belonged to a group, not to a single passerby. And the more they listened, the more they realized the music seemed fixed in one location, as though the performers were standing in a ring just beyond the reach of the porch light. The account begins with a woman named Elise, who had moved into the cabin only a few months after losing her husband. She had chosen the property because it was quiet, surrounded by a stretch of forest that offered the kind of privacy she believed she needed while adjusting to a life lived on her own. This Christmas was her first without family in the house, and although she tried to keep the traditions they once followed together, the holiday carried an unfamiliar stillness. She decorated the living room the way she always had. A small tree placed beside the window, its lights set to a gentle glow rather than the bright setting her husband preferred. She left a few ornaments in their boxes because removing them brought back too many memories at once. The cabin itself was sturdy, built decades earlier, with wooden beams that creaked whenever the temperature shifted outside. Elise kept a radio on the kitchen counter, tuned to a station that usually played seasonal music, though the signal flickered in and out due to the distance from town. Every so often, the melody would fade, replaced by a thin rush of static that lasted just long enough to unsettle the quiet before clearing again. The snowfall that evening had been steady since late afternoon, covering the walkway and piling softly against the porch steps. By the time she locked the doors for the night, the world beyond the windows looked almost untouched, with the kind of smooth, white layer that reflected the porch light in a faint, uneven glow. Inside, the only movement came from the shifting shadows cast by the tree lights as they blinked in a slow pattern across the room. Elise had spent the earlier hours trying to keep herself occupied, preparing a small meal, reading through old letters, letting the radio fill the silence. But as night crept further in, she began to notice how different the house felt compared to previous years. Every sound seemed louder than it should have been, from the wind brushing against the siding to the occasional thump of snow sliding off the roof. None of it was alarming on its own, yet together, the noises carried an edge that made her pause more often than she expected. She stepped onto the porch briefly to check the generator, pulling her coat tight as the cold pressed against her face. The forest loomed as a dark shape behind the cabin, its outlines softened by falling snow. She did not linger. The air felt heavier than usual, as if the landscape were holding its breath. When she returned inside and shut the door, She let out a slow exhale without realizing she had been holding it. This quiet, layered with the weight of her first Christmas alone, formed the backdrop against which the events of that night unfolded. A night when the stillness outside the cabin carried something far more deliberate than the natural sound she had become accustomed to. As night deepened, the wind outside the cabin softened, leaving the snowfall to drift silently onto the frozen ground. Elise was in the kitchen, listening to the faint hum of the radio when she first noticed it. A low, harmonious singing carried through the trees. At first, she thought it might be a traveler, perhaps someone stopping at a nearby cabin, but she quickly realized that no one lived nearby, not for miles. The voices came in multiple harmonies, old-fashioned and deliberate, perfectly synchronized as though trained in a formal choir. Curiosity urged her to the window. She pulled back the curtain and scanned the snow-covered clearing, but there was no one there. The snow remained untouched, smooth and undisturbed. No footprints led toward the cabin. No shadow shifted between the trees, yet the voices continued, their tone unwavering and precise. She stepped closer to the door, heart racing. The sound drew nearer, though no figure appeared. And then, just as she leaned against the porch railing, a shiver ran through her. The singing didn't stop at the door. It began to move inside the cabin, threading softly through the rooms, weaving around corners as if guided by a presence she could neither see nor reach. The harmony grew louder, more insistent, though the cabin remained empty of anyone she could identify. Elise's chest tightened as the radio flickered, the signal cutting in and out in sync with the rhythm of the music. The tree lights in the living room began to flicker as well, dimming and brightening in time with the song. Seeking some explanation, she began to move through the rooms, each step cautious, the floorboards whispering beneath her. In the hallway, she discovered a photograph she had never seen before, tucked into a drawer. It depicted a choir from the 1960s, all standing in formal attire, smiling for the camera. Elise recognized the story immediately. The entire group had perished decades earlier in a bus accident on Christmas Eve, their journey ending abruptly in snow and ice. Her hands trembled as she held the image. The voices had grown clearer, circling around her now, filling the small cabin with a sound that was at once joyful and aching, their tone almost mournful. As Elise remained frozen in place, she began to hear whispers interlaced between the harmonies. Her name was spoken, carried lightly on the breath of the song, barely audible but unmistakable. The whispers came from every direction, threading through the rooms as though the voices were moving along invisible paths she could not follow. Suddenly, the front door creaked and swung open on its own, letting in the chill of the night. Outside, small candle flames appeared, arranged in a circle atop the snow, glowing faintly, their light trembling against the shadowed trees. Elise could see no one tending them, and the snow beneath them remained perfectly smooth. A movement caught her eye, a shadow sliding across the snow outside, gliding without leaving a trace. It moved carefully, methodically, yet the snow beneath remained untouched, no indentations to mark its passage. The music, the lights, the shadows, each element of the night pressed together in a strange, layered rhythm, one that seemed to guide her attention even as it unsettled her entirely. As the night deepened, the song outside the cabin shifted. The harmonies that had once been joyful, light, and celebratory began to bend towards something mournful. The notes lingered longer, the chords stretching in a way that pressed against the walls and filled the corners of the cabin. Elise stood near the window, gripping the frame. When she saw it, a figure dressed in old choir attire, the same uniform captured in the photograph she had discovered hours earlier, standing perfectly still outside her glass. Her breath caught. The figure did not move, yet it seemed to observe her with an awareness that felt impossible for a shadow in the snow. Every instinct told her to retreat, yet she could not look away. The music pulsed softly, almost coaxing her attention toward the next startling detail. The photograph, which she had left untouched on the table, now rested on her bed. Its placement was impossible. No one had entered the room, yet the choir in the picture stared up at her, as if aware she was watching, their expressions eerily aligned with a mournful cadence drifting through the forest. Hours later, Elise found a note tucked beneath the photograph. The words were brief, written in careful, looping script. Anyone who hears the choir's final carol must join them. Confused and frightened, she scanned the image again. In the corner, written faintly but unmistakably, was a name, her name, as though it had been added long before she was born, a warning she had never anticipated. The cabin fell silent for the first time that night. When neighbors arrived days later, the home was empty. The radio still hummed softly. The tree lights flickered once, then went dark, and Elise herself was nowhere to be found. The snow outside bore no footprints, no marks of a struggle, only the gentle impression of candles that had long since burned away. The story remained, quietly circulating, a reminder of a tradition some believe exists only when the world is calm, cold, and isolated, a carol meant to be heard, a song that chooses its audience, and the consequences of listening too closely. Many cultures speak of Christmas visitations, brief appearances that occur when the world is quiet, when lights are low, and the season's memories hang in the air. Some are benign, some leave questions that cannot be answered, and others serve as reminders that even the most joyful celebrations can carry echoes from the past. If you've ever heard music at night when no one should be outside, share your story in the comments. Others may have heard it too, and together we can begin to trace the paths these sounds travel. Stay tuned for the next tale, one that will stretch further into the strange and unexplainable and linger long after the season has passed. In a remote corner of Vermont, a family ventured into the dense forest behind their cabin to select a Christmas tree. The snow crunched under their boots, and the branches above were heavy with frost, bending toward the narrow path as if warning them to turn back. They chose a tree that seemed perfect in every way, cut it carefully at its base, and carried it home, leaving the forest silent once more. That night, after the tree was set in the living room and decorated with lights, the family went to bed, expecting to wake to the usual calm of winter morning. But when the first light of dawn touched the frost outside, they were confronted with something impossible. The tree, the very one they had cut, stood upright outside the cabin again, roots and all, as though it had grown back while they slept. The ground around it was untouched. No footprints, no marks from tools, only the fresh snow, smooth and uninterrupted, and a tree that should have been lying in their living room, now alive again in the forest clearing. In many winter traditions, certain trees are said to hold power, some sacred, others cursed. Folklore tells of forests where a tree, once disturbed, will mark those who cut it, leaving traces that cannot be explained. Travelers and locals alike speak of trees that return to the earth overnight, of roots that seem to stretch and shift as though alive, and of forests that claim what is taken too hastily. These stories have persisted for generations, whispered from one winter visitor to the next, often dismissed, until something unexplainable happens. The family in this account had traveled to a remote lodge deep in the forest, seeking a quiet Christmas away from the noise of the city. The father, determined to select a tree with his own hands, ignored the warnings of locals about a section of the woods known only as the Marked Grove. He insisted it would be simple: choose, cut, and return. Snow fell heavily that afternoon, covering the trail and bending the branches above, making each step uncertain. The air was still, broken only by the distant cracking of ice-laden limbs and the soft crunch of their boots on the frozen path. The quiet seemed to stretch, holding them in the forest's embrace, and every sound, even the faintest shift of snow, carried a weight that made the family pause and look around, though nothing moved. By the time they reached the grove, the tree they would cut was already drawing attention, its branches reaching outward, its shape perfect. At that moment, the forest felt more alive than they had expected, yet the father moved forward, oblivious to the tension settling in the air. The events that followed would change their understanding of the woods forever, and the tree they chose would not remain where they placed it. As the father cut into the tree they had chosen, he noticed unusual markings etched deeply into the bark, patterns that seemed deliberate, almost like symbols. The sap that oozed from the trunk carried a metallic scent, sharp and unfamiliar, clinging to his gloves and the air around them. He shook it off and continued, but an unease had already begun to settle over the cabin, as if the forest had followed them home. That night, after the tree was set in the living room and decorated, the family sat together, trying to ignore the tension that hung in the air. Then came the first sound, soft tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, echoing across the wooden floorboards, coming from the direction of the living room. They paused, straining to hear, but when they turned, there was nothing. The tree stood still, its lights dim, yet the tapping continued intermittently, refusing to stop, as though someone, or something, was testing the boundaries of their home. As the night progressed, the lights on the tree began to flicker, dimming and brightening in irregular patterns, like a slow, uneven breathing. Ornaments trembled, cracked along old seams, and tiny fragments fell silently to the floor. A damp trail appeared on the hardwood, starting at the base of the tree and winding its way toward the stairs, glistening faintly in the glow of the Christmas lights. The family tried to rationalize the events. An uneven floorboard, condensation, maybe even a prank. But the unease deepened when their son awoke the next morning, and the strange markings they had seen etched into the tree's bark were now faintly visible on his arm, as though transferred overnight. They could not explain how it had happened, and a fear settled that the tree they had brought inside was far from ordinary. And the marks they saw on the tree's bark appeared on their son's arm overnight. Searching for answers, the family learned that the grove from which they had cut the tree belonged to an abandoned settlement that had vanished during a harsh winter 80 years earlier. The few records that remained told of villagers trapped by snow and ice, disappearing one by one, leaving behind only the cabins and trees they once tended. Local legends suggested that the spirits of those who perished still lingered, inhabiting the marked trees of the forest, attached to them in ways no one fully understood. By the following night, their son began speaking of whispers from inside the trunk of the tree, faint voices calling his name, coaxing him closer. At first, they assumed it was imagination, the effect of shadows and the dim lights. But the whispers grew more distinct, more urgent, and the air around the tree seemed colder than the rest of the cabin. Every sound, every movement felt as though it had a deliberate rhythm, guiding him toward the tree and the mysteries it held within its bark. As the nights passed, the tree's presence became impossible to ignore. Even when the family left the room, the branches seemed to shift subtly, bending or twitching without any breeze or touch. The lights on the tree dimmed and flickered in a rhythm that felt deliberate, almost aware. Their dog, normally eager to explore every corner of the cabin, refused to enter the room entirely, retreating to the doorway and growling softly at nothing visible. One morning, the family awoke to a sight that left them frozen. The tree, which they had decorated and placed in the living room, was gone. In its place, outside the front door, it stood upright in the snow, roots embedded in the frozen ground, as if it had grown back in the night. The ground around it bore no footprints, no signs that anyone had moved it. It was as though the tree had returned to the forest on its own terms, leaving the family to question whether they had ever possessed it at all. The following night brought a horror the family could not have anticipated. Their son disappeared. The cabin was silent except for the wind, and when the parents searched outside, they found footprints leading from the door into the forest, but only one set returned. The trail seemed to vanish into the darkness, leaving them with the terrifying certainty that he had followed the tree into the grove. Later that morning, the tree outside the cabin appeared changed. Its bark had begun to split, deep cracks revealing a hollow inside, as though something was trying to emerge. The branches stretched unnaturally, and the snow around its base had melted despite the cold, as if the tree itself had drawn energy from the earth. Every instinct in the family screamed that the forest had claimed more than they realized. Days later, locals reported the tree had returned to the grove from which it was originally taken. New markings had appeared along its bark, unmistakably resembling the shape of the missing boy. According to the villagers, the forest has rules older than memory. Once a tree from the marked grove is removed, something must take its place, a balance that cannot be broken. The family never recovered their son, and the tree remains a cautionary tale whispered to those who venture too deeply into the woods at Christmas. Some traditions endure because they are warnings disguised as ritual. Forests hold memories, and snow-covered trees can carry them in ways we cannot measure. The story of the marked grove is not an isolated legend. It is part of a pattern repeated wherever humans disturb what should remain untouched. If you have ever felt watched in the woods, heard whispers among the branches, or seen shapes move when no one should be present, share your story in the comments. And remember, some traditions exist for a reason, guiding us to respect the unseen, the old, and the wild.